It's time for the Russ Belville Show's Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earleywine. Dr. Earleywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and a leading author and researcher on cannabinoids and health, who pins the Ask Dr. Mitch column for High Times magazine. Get your questions ready in our live chat or call in to 971-533-7111 now.
Welcome back, everyone. 29 after the hour, and we've got Dr. Mitch on the line. How you doing, Dr. Mitch?
Okie dokie.
Glad to have you here, sir. Remind everyone, if you got a question, get it into our chat room. We'll ask it as soon as we can, or you can call in live at 971-533-7111. We always like to start by giving Dr. Mitch the first word to tell us the latest in cannabis science. So what's up, Dr. Mitch?
Oh, a couple, 3 studies, as you mentioned. Some coverage from a study back in September about marijuana fighting Alzheimer's disease. I'm happy to elaborate on. Then we've got the work on the marijuana breath test, and then kind of misreported Vanderbilt study suggesting ways to end marijuana addiction that goes a little bit beyond the data. Any of those strike your fancy?
Yeah, the breath test one, that's happening up at Washington State University in Eastern Washington. Quite interested in that, because what we've always heard is that, there's no real good way of detecting whether or not someone's impaired. Is this a situation where if they build the detector, they're just going to set a number so the detector will work?
Sad but true. I'm afraid that is the case. And as I've mentioned in the past, I'd rather see some kind of roadside sobriety, ride the unicycle, juggle, whatever, something that can show that people are competent to drive, rather than that they have some certain number of nanograms per milliliter of blood, because as we know, daily users can develop a lot of tolerance, and in truth, medical users absolutely have to be above that 5 nanograms per milliliter in order to get, some of the medicinal effects they need. So I feel like this is a step in the wrong direction. I always admire, people's technological abilities, but I just don't think that this is going to help with what we really need.
Yeah, what I'm reading on this, they talk about, first marketing it to states that have zero tolerance, where just the detection is enough, and then we can say, hey, now we can bust somebody with that. My thought is that once they have a detector, the next states that want to pass legalization will say, well, since we have a detector, let's make use of it. What differences, if any, are there with them trying to detect out of our breath rather than urine or blood? And specifically with respect to how long would that test be valid? I mean, would this be an argument that, hey, at least it's detecting recent use rather than 2 weeks ago?
I mean, with the alcohol world as kind of our guide, it would definitely be better than a urine screen, or potentially better than a blood sample. But again, I've never been a fan of those zero tolerance laws. I feel like depending upon the reliability of any machine, to get a 0 is a completely ridiculous proposal. And it really doesn't co-vary with what we care about, which is impaired driving.
Right. And all right, well, we'll keep people focused on this breath thing as it continues on. Now, let's talk about that Vanderbilt study. You said it was a bit misreported. Explain why.
The bottom line here is they're framing this as, hey, we've got a way to combat marijuana addiction. Now, I mean, whether you think marijuana addiction is a serious problem is a whole separate study. But as you read along, basically what they've done is genetically modify these mice so that they produce more 2-AG. And 2-AG is this endogenous cannabinoid, one that's in your body all the time anyway. And then they say, well, based on that, we see that those mice end up looking kind of anxious, and so therefore if we could fix the 2-AG molecule, then they'd be less anxious, they'd be less likely to smoke pot, and then we could battle marijuana addiction. I mean, it's literally 4 steps downstream. I love that we can alter mice to have them produce more 2-AG and find out more about the endocannabinoid system, but that's independent of any kind of weird clinical implications for an imaginary marijuana addiction.
You bring up 2-AG, and that dovetails perfectly into a question from our chat room. Brian wanted to know, what are the endogenous cannabinoids? How many of them do we make, and what are they called?
So far, the ones that have the most literature on them are 2-AG and then anandamide, which is from the Sanskrit word for bliss, which is kind of telling. And both of those are pretty much direct agonists of the CB1 receptor, meaning that they get to fire the way basically only an endogenous cannabinoid could. THC is really only a partial agonist. It doesn't really fire the same way. As it turns out, anandamide tends to decay rather rapidly, so it doesn't make the CB1 receptor fire as rapidly as THC does. But THC also doesn't seem to do it with the same kind of magnitude, if you will, with the same sort of big dramatic effect. And so I feel like it's not necessarily some divine plan that cannabis and humans co-evolved, so much as, hey, we happen to find something out in nature that seems to resonate with a system we already had.
Excellent. All right. And we also, another question coming in from the chat room from Bob, wanted to know if you know anything about having a medical marijuana card and being on SSI. Can they take your SSI away if you get a medical marijuana card?
It's really getting hairy, and it's different in different states, so I can't say, oh, here's how it is across the universe or anything like that. But at least, what a surprise, a couple of the southern states have decided that in order to get any kind of funding or state support, even unemployment and things like that, you have to pass a drug test, which I think is outrageously crazy and unfair and kind of implies that drug users are incapable of finding jobs, which we've got tons of data to suggest that's not the case at all.
But in a medical marijuana state, have you ever heard a case of someone losing their SSI? I know in Oregon, SSI is one of the ways you can prove that you get a reduced fee for the card. So I don't think they'd be taking it away here.
Yeah, at least trying to think through. I mean, now that they're 23, it's a little harder. I mean, I'm happy to have this problem, but it's a little harder to say for sure. I cannot recall someone emailing me about this or reading about it before. That doesn't mean it's never happened.
Yeah, I'm racking my brain too. I don't recall anyone losing SSI. I've heard of, veterans getting messed with their pain contracts at the VA. That's about as much as I've heard the government messing with individual users that way. But we could be wrong. If anyone knows, please let us know through the chat room or through email. Dr. Mitch, I had a question for you, which has to do with the intake of cannabis based on one's BMI. I'm doing a rant right after this segment about the whole Michael Brown case. And one of the toxicologists in the case testified that he had 12 nanograms of THC in his system, and that for a big guy like him to get to 12 nanograms, he had to have smoked a whole lot of marijuana as compared to like a 100-pound person would get to 12 nanograms pretty quick. Is there a body weight relationship to how high your nanograms per milliliter would be after you smoked pot?
No, as it turns out, that's a confusion with the alcohol literature. So anytime you ingest something orally, anytime you're going to have the stomach and the liver involved, you really do have a body mass issue. So, if you and I drank 4 beers, it's way different from some 98-pound person drinking 4 beers, in part because the beer is only going to be distributed in lean body mass, and so they just don't have as much to spread it around. They do end up with higher blood alcohol concentrations. For THC, more leads to higher, but it's nowhere near the same because you're not going through the stomach. You're going from the lungs and then literally right into the bloodstream that, the blood that goes right to the brain and heart, basically. So it's nowhere near the same kind of relation. So, in fact, this guy could have spiked above 12 nanograms after a couple of puffs. And, in fact, we have some urinary data, at least, to suggest that that's the case for people essentially uncorrected for weight. Regardless of weight, we would expect something like that. It would have implied that he'd been high relatively recently or that he was a regular user. But I want to emphasize, too, that cannabis doesn't increase aggression. Our laboratory data suggests decreases or has no impact.
Yeah, the terminology the toxicologist used in the transcript was a bigger receptacle, and he seemed to be arguing that even if you were smoking, since a 300-pound person has more blood, then if they both smoked the same amount, there'd be a dilution, more of a dilution in the larger person because they have more blood. But that seemed like ridiculous to me.
Well, we're talking about something that's psychoactive in nanograms, right? So literally, we're talking about some really subtle distinctions that probably have no implication for subjective effects or any kind of real level of behavior. So technically, yes, he's correct, but again, it's nowhere near parallel to the way alcohol works. Okay.
Yeah, and he did actually mention alcohol as an analogy, so I that was my first tip-off that, wait a minute, this guy, I don't know where he's going with this.
No, that's completely misleading.
Yeah. Let's go to the Alzheimer's data. This was something that, we uncovered earlier this year, back in September, I believe. But for folks that may not have caught that, what can we tell folks about the use of cannabis to treat Alzheimer's?
Just as I kind of make fun of folks for going too far from the data in the bad way, we can often go too far from data that are on our side too. So there seems to be an interesting set of data now where basically THC is interfering with some of the processes that are related to Alzheimer's, particularly this amyloid beta, which is very common among folks with dementia when they're autopsied after death. This is a big thing to me because my mom is demented, and I'm constantly poring over this literature. But the bottom line is this is we're still in the kind of petri dish stage here, and we don't want to just assume that, hey, if you smoke marijuana, you're not going to get Alzheimer's, because it's just not where the data are. I do think this is particularly promising. I like this Gary Wenk quotation because he's the guy who's actually showed that there's neurogenesis that's related to cannabinoids and stuff like that. But we're many steps away from just, hey, give grandpa a toke and he's not going to be demented anymore.
Now, for the medical marijuana states that do recognize Alzheimer's as a treatable condition, that's mostly the agitation we're talking about, correct?
In fact, and appetite, and that weight loss is actually very good predictor of death and dementia. So you definitely want to make sure you try to maintain your body mass any way you can. And we have the legendary, improved appetite with THC. And then they're markedly less agitated, and it actually looks pretty pleasant to them. So it's not like they're vegetable the way they are on some of the chemical straitjackets that you see from the prescription drug companies. They're just happier and less irritable.
All right. Well, Dr. Mitch, thank you so much for joining us on our Mondays. And from our audience, the folks heard about last week, and they did want to offer their condolences to you and your family in your loss from last week. But we hope your holidays are getting better and brighter.
My enthusiastic thanks. Thanks so much.
All right. When we come back, folks, we'll have time for a little radical rant. Like I said, we're going to talk about Ferguson, Missouri, the toxicology, the reports from the